The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
My name is Andy Polk. I'm an assistant professor in MTSU's history department. I'm technically director of history education. I was a high school teacher for many years before going on my graduate work. And in a shameless recruiting plug, I'm also coordinator of Middle Tennessee History Day. If you have not heard of or participated in History Day, please talk to me. It's a great thing. Last year, 400 students came on campus just for the region. They do original research, create documentaries, websites, do papers, poster presentations. It really is a great thing, and they love doing it. It's a project of taking these skills and developing them. So we'd love for you to participate in that. The workshop is co-sponsored by the History Department and Teaching with Primary Sources with the Library of Congress, but one of those is based here at MTSU, something that we love doing. You may have been a participant of one of those workshops beforehand. So our first speaker is Dr. Mary Evans. She is an associate professor in the history department and also the coordinator of the American Democracy Project here on campus. So trying to increase engagement local through state and federal levels of civic engagement, not just voting, but also the great work that we do through our communities and making them good together. She also is an expert, University of Chicago PhD, am I correct? We won't hold that against her. We have old rivalries there. She is an expert in this subject, the Progressive Era. First book, Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era, Toward the Public Sphere in the New South. So this is definitely in her wheelhouse. Regionally, especially, she's one of the go-to scholars in this field. So I'm going to hand it over to her. Any questions you have, we'll have time at the end.
Thanks to Dr. Polk. Also thank Stacy Graham and Kira Duke from the Center for Historic Preservation and Teaching with Primary Sources, all of whom asked me to be here today. I'm Mary Evans, as Dr. Polk mentioned, and indeed I do women's history, and I specialize on this time period. And I also head the American Democracy Project. I am in charge for this university of our programs for civic learning across the disciplines. And by that, we mean here at MTSU that we work to make civic learning pervasive, not partial, central, not peripheral to all the work that we do on this campus. And in order to pull that off, the objective, both for higher education and K-12, is to understand that we as teachers have a tripartite system of obligations. We all go for the curriculum piece, the content piece, which is at the top, and certainly I'm sure you all focus on this as well. And we absolutely do, according to state directive here at MTSU, to focus on the career piece. We want our students, when they get out, to be able to get a good job and move directly into production system of Tennessee and the United States. But lest we forget that, honestly, within this tripartite system, what's incredibly powerful is that every one of our students leaves as a citizen of this country. And I know for a fact that this idea of citizenship is what motivates me to teach, and it's really what probably motivates you to teach as well, because it's what gives us meaning, because we all believe we want to be advocates for truth, justice, and the American way. So I'm being perfectly serious here when I say that now more than ever, it is incumbent on us as teachers within public institutions to counteract our students' cynicism. You all get them through age 18. I get them at age 18 when they come on to me. But I am here to advocate that unless we be the counterbalance, and I don't think we used to, And I, as with Andy, taught in public schools for many years as well. And I think being able to do the understory and underbelly tale of cynicism when I was a teacher in the high school classroom was fun to sort of counteract the rah-rah, but it is quite flipped now. And I have to come off like super patriot in order for my students not to feel in gross negativity. So being that counterweight, being able to advocate that the pen is mightier than the sword, that the ballot box is the American way, that voting is the responsibility of citizenship, and that folks who engage in public service actually are public servants by and large, and they're not all conniving, evil, out swamp dwellers here to drag us down, and which I think primarily these days most of our students tend to feel. So all of that about engagement certainly has a broad umbrella, includes many topics, many subjects. Voting is a piece of that. And I know your schools tend to do voting drives senior year, get those students who are turning 18, try to get them in part of the system. We do that as soon as they come here, and we ask them then, are you already registered to vote? Do you need to shift? Are you going to live here on campus or in Rutherford County? Then let's get you re-registered. Because now, as of this past year, we can do it online, which makes it so easy. So bear in mind that everything I do and all the history I teach is about civic learning. It's always my primary objective because you know and I know that what we do as faculty members is that we operate with the model of backward design, which is what's our objective, what are we trying to achieve, what's our outcome, what are we teaching toward. And for me, the civic learning piece is always that primary larger objective. It's what we start with. It's our highest objective of learning. It's what we need our students to take away. And as we engage in a narrative, we understand that that's ultimately our true goal, and that memorizing facts is really not what our objective is. Even though we have standards that we adhere to, and the facts are relevant, and they do need a good skeletal structure of facts and dates to order to interpret and think about ideas, but to be explicit about the fact that the key ideas about students' roles in society, what they're actively being engaged in, what they're called on to do, and that it's not just their parents' responsibility, that it's their responsibility. I think this year we have seen this energetic group of high school students from the Florida high school that have really modeled for all of our students what that's really like. And I can tell you, because I teach entering freshmen, I hear students all the time who do not want to register to vote. I don't believe in government. They say it's not my job. I don't get involved. That doesn't relate to me. I don't have the time. I'm way too busy. I work. And then there's the ever pervasive, my vote doesn't matter anyway argument. These are really un-American, passive, irresponsible, and inappropriate activities. As we all know, Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it, it is ours to keep it," and we as history professors have a very sacred duty to carry on this work. So this is what I genuinely believe in, and I believe it's my greatest calling as a professor. It provides me the truest meaning, and it reminds me every day why I'm still in the classroom. So that voting piece gets me back again to what I'm supposed to be here to talk about. Before I leave this, though, I just want to point out in the Truth, Justice, and American Way analogy that MTSU's Dean of Media and Entertainment, Dean Ken Paulson, who's with the First Amendment Center in Nashville. He's been with the museum in Washington, D.C. He oversees the Siegenthaler Chair of First Amendment Studies here at MTSU. He has a fabulous TEDx talk that was done in Nashville just in the last number of months. So if you Google just TEDx and Ken Paulson, that'll come up for you. He talks about the critical role of the Fourth Estate in his advocacy for the First Amendment. So again, for us as historians, civic learning is really, really easy. As I advocate across our university for civic learning across the disciplines, I must tell you it's sometimes much more complicated when I try to advocate to the faculty members in aeronautics or in the history of polka dots or in agriculture, that they too must do civic learning, because we know, you know, and I know that every single one of our students graduates as an American citizen and leaves this country with our classes, our courses, and our schools to integrate into American society and has that role and responsibility. But a teeny weeny percentage, and I need to know what that percentage is, graduates as a poli-sci major. So often, back in my day, it was, oh, if they want to be interested in that, that's for the poli-sci department to deal with. But we know that's untrue, and we know it because of the apathy and poor voting that goes on in our society, and often just the apathy about everything else for that matter. So this is my book cover from 2013. I do women's studies. I focus on this time period globally, nationally, and also here in Tennessee. And University of Tennessee Press published this in 2013. It's now officially 5 years old. But we are working right now on our second volume, which will be out hopefully at the end of 2019, certainly by 2020, because we're getting ready to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And our new book, which is even more broad and comprehensive, is meant to address the lacuna and the issues that we were not able to cover in the first volume, which I must tell you, when I moved back to Tennessee from Washington, D.C., I'd been with the Smithsonian for a number of years, I was struck when I got here by what we will talk about today, the narrative, the perfect 36th, which immediately overwhelmed me as a Tennessean as uncontextualized. Everything was about the perfect 36th narrative, and these women suffragists in Tennessee rose as if from the head of Zeus, without any historic context whatsoever. And in our first volume, we attempted to lay a platform and a groundwork for what was going on in terms of women's studies and women's actions and women's engagement in the state of Tennessee that had been utterly disregarded and unlooked at until this volume came out, and we're going to do even more of that. But as we approach the centennial of the 19th, clearly the perfect 36 is back on the radar screen. We just like to expand the narrative a great deal. And because of that, I'm a member of the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Centennial Collaborative, which is a wonderful group, and again, you can Google this. Museum folks and historians and educators from across the state who are looking for the academic platform and groundwork for getting ready to study and experience the centennial of the 19th with our students. And so almost every one of our state's historical societies is involved with this. Center for Historic Preservation here at MTSU hosts the website, so they're pivotal. And obviously, Dr. Carol Van West, who is the Tennessee State historian, is underlying this effort that's coming out of MTSU, but also East Tennessee Historical Society, Humanities Tennessee in Nashville. There's something called Chick History, the March to the 19th. I bet you've heard of them, that have been going around to communities collecting stories. The National Civil Rights Museum is involved with this from Memphis. The Pink Palace Museum, also in Memphis. Teaching with Primary Sources here at MTSU. The Department of Tourist Development, because we want all of our students to get out and see these sites and be a part of it. The Tennessee Historical Commission, State Library and Archives, Tennessee State Museum, all of these entities are involved in this wonderful collaborative. So there is so much material out there online for you to access and for your students to access. Right now, it's a peak moment to be doing women's history. So we got to carpe diem with all of this and grab it. But physically also, it's really going to be wonderful for your students to get out and experience this, have some of this experiential learning and be a part of what's happening around the state. And obviously one of the newest pieces has been the dedication of the suffrage monument at Centennial Park. And I know you know about it if you haven't already been to see it. It's very close to the Parthenon. It has 5 of our state's suffragists, Frankie Pierce from Nashville, Sue Shelton White from West Tennessee, Henderson and Jackson, and Dallas Dudley from in Nashville, Abby Crawford Milton from Chattanooga, and it also has Carrie Chapman Catt. We imported her, of course, from Washington and the NASA headquarters to come down and be in our statue, and she also came to Tennessee that steamy summer of 1920. And that one's easy to get to. It will be fully in place. It's on kind of just like a metal tin because the state park system is having to build a groundwork for its permanent emplacement. So it's not physically at this point where it's going to be finally emplaced by 2020. But other areas and counties and cities across the state are working on this as well. Montgomery County, Clarksville, groups of women there meeting because Clarksville didn't really know if it had any suffragists. So the way we're sort of modeling going about this is digging into newspapers I mean, a lot of these clubs and women's associations that existed in the late 1800s into the beginning of the 20th century did not have written records that have survived anyway. And county historians don't tend to know about it. So people are just doing this sort of deep dive into local community newspapers to see what women's clubs were meeting, what church groups were meeting, to be able to try to know how many women's groups were involved in both social reform issues and then also suffrage activity. So Clarksville has done an enormous amount of research just in the last year. This is all brand new. And they have been in fundraising mode to build to construct and have designed a woman suffrage statue there. Memphis is creating its own. They're unveiling a new one in the spring, about this time next year, in 2019. It's supposedly going to coincide with Memphis's bicentennial. And people are trying to do it in different ways. It's because we've had virtually nothing up until very recently, because women's history has been hidden. And even in the present day, it's pretty embarrassing to think that that's the case. Just recently, in fact, it was just May of last year, so literally a year ago, this bust of Sue Shelton White was installed on the courthouse square in Madison County in Jackson. I went to see it this winter, long overdue, because Sue Shelton White, of course, is the only Tennessee suffragist who was actually incarcerated. She was part of the National Women's Party, and up until last year, there was nothing to commemorate her across the state. And probably most of you have seen the one in Knoxville on Market Square, because it's the one that's been around the longest. It's been here for over 10 years now, and it was originally designed by Alan LeQuire, who did the one in Nashville at Centennial Park. And it's only got 3 women in it. It was the first one to go up in the state of Tennessee, so it was trying to represent the 3 grand divisions. So it has Lizzie Crozier French from East Tennessee, it has Ann Dallas Dudley from Nashville, and has Elizabeth Avery Merriweather from Memphis, who was involved in suffrage for many years, but she died before the suffrage amendment was approved. Knoxville, since it did that back in 2006, is attempting to update itself. And Knoxville wants to unveil a brand new statue, which it's going to be doing in the next number of months. And it's actually sort of appropriating Harry Byrne and his mother, Feb Ensminger, I've always had a hard time pronouncing her last name, Ensminger Byrne, who are from Nyota, from Athens, from McMinn County, but their statue, sadly, is not going to be going in McMinn County. It's going to go in Knoxville, and as I understand it, it'll be pretty much maybe on the East Tennessee Historical Society Museum site, close right there again to Market Square. So note that these sites are going up across the state, and with them has been created, again, just recently, this thing just opened to the public like maybe last week, the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Heritage Trail. And I would have given you a map of it, but the website does not have a single Tennessee map. They've broken it up, sadly, into maybe for practical reasons, I am not their web designer. They've broken it up into 3 sections. There's East, Middle, and West. I tried to sort of piece them together for a big map for a talk I was giving a couple of weeks ago, and it's pretty distorted, so I didn't do it again. But go on their website. Again, it's the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Heritage Trail. You can click on the division that is relevant to you or that might be close to you, or you could possibly take your students, and you can see what some of the examples are. Bear in mind that what this is trying to do is so important and so noteworthy because it's calling attention to, it's giving a name to, it is identifying and labeling actions of women and what women did in this state. So critically important because there's been precious little sort of monumental representation, both in Tennessee and nationally. So statues are one thing, but we can't rely on those. So this heritage trail has their tombstones. So if there's some famous, interesting woman in your community whose tombstone is in your local town or county cemetery, who needs to be on the Heritage Trail map, by gum, put her in there. Just email the folks, because they're really very flexible this time. This is a work in progress, and this is something your students could get involved in, again, by combing newspapers and microfilm for whatever the local county paper is at the local county seat, and trying to figure out, and the best way to go about and do it is to look at the women's clubs in your county and in your service area for the newspaper to see, through the chat columns that they wrote at the turn of the last century, that, Mrs. Joe Blow went over to Mrs. Harry Smith's house and had tea, and they discussed, whatever the topic is. And sometimes this is really difficult to get at, but I am plodding through it in the area that I'm historically from, which is the Tennessee Upper Cumberland. And I'm going through the newspapers in the Upper Cumberland to try to do this very thing, because all of these women's statues that we have represented so far come from Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis, and Chattanooga. And we've added Jackson recently, which is a nice thing. But, we have 95 counties in this state. And that means if that's where the history is so far, there are 90 counties that are not represented historically by what women are doing. And my ancestors were in those counties, all over the Upper Cumberland. And I can tell you, I knew some of those women's children anyway. They were active and not passive. And I just know they were involved in this issue. I don't know, and I was too young when they passed away to have come to my own understanding of the time period to be able to discuss that, for instance, with my grandmother, who was born in the 1800s. But there's information to be had there, and as I say, counties that are really digging in, doing student research, are coming up with it. In terms of monuments themselves, I just wanted to tell you that the Smithsonian did a study, an account, just at the beginning of 2016 about how many public statues there are across the United States depicting women in U.S. history. And there are fewer than 400, and there are almost 6,000 statues and monuments. Now, bear in mind, we won't segue into the Civil War statues issue. We will just leave that for now. But I'll just go ahead and tell you my personal bias, which is I don't give a flip. Leave them out there. They're part of U.S. history, but then inundate with the women. It's an add-on process as far as I'm concerned. Make it richer. Tell the full story, the good, bad, and the ugly. Anyway, all that is to say, we are sorely imbalanced. And Smithsonian tells us that a mere 13% of the public statues belong to women. And in this same article in February 2016, they pointed out that absolutely none, zero, of the National Park Service memorials, like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and all of those, were about women. But things are changing. Before President Obama left office, he dedicated the Belmont Paul House, what had been a National Register home in Washington, D.C. that was the Belmont Sewell House, which is where Alice Paul and the National Women's Party were headquartered. And Alice Paul lived in that house until her death. But because there was the realization that, in fact, in all of NPS land, there was virtually nothing to women, the Obama administration worked with the National Park Service to dedicate the Belmont Paul House as the Women's Equality National Monument of the National Park Service. So I presume this was by April 2016, just a few months after that Smithsonian article came out. And as I say, it can't all be monuments. I happen to have been to the Living Heritage Museum in McMinn County just this past summer because I wanted to go to Harry Burns' home. I wanted to see the college where Feb Ensminger Byrne had been educated. Methodists, by the way, those of you who come from Methodist background, those Methodist women were incredible during the latter part of the 1800s and moving into the 20th century. And once again, Feb was one of those as well and was educated at a women's Methodist school. But her desk, which has been in the Byrne family until this past summer, was donated to the McMinn County Living Heritage Museum in Athens. And, that's going to get up on that heritage trail. It's not a historic marker. It's not a statue. It's not a cemetery marker, but we have to kind of, do the best we can in terms of finding these ideas that are forward-thinking for our students to learn about and to recognize what the roles of women were through time. So that's by way of setup. And in the time we have left, I realize they're just topics I want to kind of go off PowerPoint and just talk off the top of my head about some of the things I care about. Suffragists, I want to take a look at your standards. I want to look at the narrative, the perfect 36th, but I really want to talk about the backstory, which is women's work and women's associations. There's the progressive era political framework that's critical to all of this, on which all of it hangs. I want to make a brief reference to Elizabeth Israels Perry, who gave a profound paper in 2000 that we all use as sort of a seminal structure on which to evaluate the progressive era. I brought my own scales of justice to share with you, which is just a tool for education that I use in my college classrooms, and it seems to work. It has a little bit of a visual impact. I want to mention what we did in the first volume of Tennessee Women Progressives, the upcoming volume that's in progress, and to suggest what you can do with your students in your communities, which is all about civic lessons and for sure getting them to vote. So let me start with my first one, my personal pet peeve. Let me be clear to discuss with you that the word is suffragist. Eek! Do not use suffragette, please. I beg of you. I beg of you. It was used by the British women. So just historically to get that correct, and I've given you the suffragists in their own publications and in their own phraseology, and the newspapers who supported them used the word suffragist. Anytime the et was used was pejorative, derogatory, put down the little ladies, aren't they sweet? So I view it pretty harshly, and consequently, when I took a look at your state standards, there it was. There it was. Okay. It's like fingernails on the blackboard to me. The state of Tennessee wants you to be sure that you cover in your classrooms the activities of the suffragists, the passage of the 19th by the Tennessee General Assembly, Tennessee's role, of course, and who the key leaders were. And in this particular listing, they give us 3 key names. So, Ann Dudley, Harry Byrne, Josephine Pearson. So in other words, this is absolutely the perfect 36th narrative. So let's just briefly say what it is. The National American Woman Suffrage Association identifies Tennessee as being a pivot state. Comes here in the summer of 2020. The Tennessee organizations hang out at the Hermitage Hotel. The anti-suffragists, Josephine Pearson, hang out at the Hermitage Hotel. It must have been a really busy place. And the governor of the state of Tennessee calls a special session of the legislature. And ultimately, there are various pieces of the puzzle which have to do with different legislators from different counties and different districts whose votes shifted, and there's various individual papers that are written about those. But ultimately, probably the big narrative that we promulgate here in Tennessee is the letter that Feb Byrne wrote to her son, suggesting that he be a good boy and put the rat in ratification, and there's our perfect 36 narrative. In it, of course, the dates that are relevant. I've slapped up there. We had the vote on the 18th of August, signed by the governor a few days later, and then went on to be certified by the U.S. Secretary of State a few days after that. And there's that very classic picture of Harry Byrne on the step of the Tennessee Capitol on the day of the vote, supposedly. At least that's how the picture is captioned, shaking hands with various of the suffrage organizers. So again, there's just an enormous amount written about this. I mean, this particular volume here, which was done at the time of the 75th centennial, not centennial, the 75th commemoration of the 19th Amendment, has a lot of pictures, and it's really encapsulates the good story. I did not bring my own personal copy of Elizabeth Taylor's book, a different Elizabeth Taylor, but she went to graduate school at Vanderbilt in the 1950s, and she really wrote sort of a first pulling together of the story of the suffragists that had really been lost in the ensuing couple of decades. And She did that for a master's thesis at Vanderbilt, and it went on to be published, and it was republished again in the 70s, which is the volume that I have. And then so many other volumes. You're welcome to look at these. I brought them. They're just baseline, and many, many more, obviously, in Tennessee Historical Quarterly on this narrative. Dr. Polk was gracious to send me the state standards for the Progressive Era, and they're really comprehensive and really good. So you all have a lot of latitude for looking at so many different subjects and sort of going about it. But I can tell you that I still get students entering my first semester freshman year at MTSU honors history classes who tell me that pretty much they've got a singularly male-built narrative. They are keenly aware who Theodore Roosevelt was. They know somewhat about prior to that, the populists maybe a bit, and they know a little about the election of 1896. They've heard about the election of 1912. They know about Woodrow Wilson and World War I. And really, that's about the extent of it. And I certainly go through all of those materials as well. That's the sort of male-built political framing on which all of our histories must be taught. But when Elizabeth Israels Perry gave a talk in 2000 and then published in the very first issue of the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in 2002, she used the term, and I guess it was during that time, that sort of silly book on men are from Mars, women are from Venus. What was that? I don't even know who wrote that, but I seem to remember it in my peripheral vision. She kind of co-opted that phraseology. She said men are from the Gilded Age, women are from the Progressive Era, was when she was asked to serve on the board of SHGAPE, the Society for the History of Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and she had said she would never do such a thing, but when they finally asked her to do so, she said she surely must do, because she needed to be a part of the decision making and represent the Progressive Era. And really, what she effectively did was reframe and refocus what Progressive Era teaching can and should be about. She made a comment in this talk, and it's up there again in Bacteria Letters, that the coming of women's history, starting in really not effectively until the 1970s, it starts gaining some speed in the 1980s. But by the time she writes this at the beginning of the 2000s, she says, 15, 20 years have passed since women's history really took over the American curriculum, and there have been sweeping changes. She observes this 15 to 20 years later that the sweeping changes have not been so pervasive, and I'm here to attest that they have not been so pervasive either. And it's a question of time. I mean, I was hearing you all as we were doing setup saying you're doing all of U.S. history in one semester. How is that humanly possible? I know you've got it all, you're cramming it in there, and we all feel the same way. So I don't know realistically how you touch all the points that need to be touched. It's an impossible task. It's Herculean. I thought I would just sort of give you some of the framing that I do in my own classes for the students who leave you and come to me, and for many of them, I'm sure it's hearing the same thing that they heard in your classes. But I try to do it visually, and part of what we're attempting to do here today is sort of provide some tools that you might use. But I really do use the scales of justice analogy because the dichotomy that is drawn between Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and there's so many periods in U.S. history that do this swing, and I realize it's generalizing in the greatest way possible. But still in all, it's a sort of a functional paradigm that helps students understand imbalance of power. So, I have I have a sort of social progressivism hit list and all the things that we've been reading about and we've been building toward. We talk about socialism, we talk about Eugene Debs, we go into all of the labor movement. We talk about populism and democracy from the latter part of the 1800s. We build on the temperance movement. We go into sort of purity and anti-prostitution, the Mann Act, some of those early pieces of legislation in the early part of the 20th century, things that have to do with social justice and legal justice. We certainly compare and contrast the social gospel with social Darwinism. Obviously, Jane Addams and Henry Street's Settlement House in New York and Hull House in Chicago. Those are talked about a great deal. And then absolutely going into the women's movement. And then we talk about women's associations, National Congress of Mothers, all of the women's trade union leagues, the women's political organizations, American Federation of Jewish Women, the National Association of Colored Women, all the organizations that started in the 1890s. And then we, of course, talk about the early civil rights movement from the Niagara movement, and the formation of the NAACP and the anti-lynching crusade. And then, of course, really critical, the muckrakers, which bring the voice and visibility to the work that's being done, and the development of schools and education, the formation of our public universities as well, the emergence of efficiency and intellectualism and statistics and analysis and social controls that the dawning 20th century articulated. And with that, the professionalization of our degrees and requirements and how to become a doctor and meeting the minimum requirements in education, all of these things start being set in place. The emergence of self-analysis, sociology and anthropology, and the evaluation of American societies. And then the outcome of early parts of legislation, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, and the ways in which government cleanup starts happening, and that our political figures start articulating that at the state level and at the community level. Everyone from Tom Johnson in Cleveland and Robert La Follette in Wisconsin and Hiram Johnson in California looking at initiative, referendum, and recall. And then going on to the federal level to talk about the changes in legislation that gave us initially the Sherman Act and on into the progressive legislation for Woodrow Wilson. Conservation and preservation fit in there as well. We can go on and look at Native Americans and see the transitions that were late in coming and difficult in coming, and starting with what progressives viewed as the at least wasn't killing Native peoples with the Dawes Severalty Act, but we see their intentions as having been mixed blessings. We know that the influx of immigrants during the latter part of the 1800s compelled a desire for Ellis Island and Angel Island, and then the presidencies after the dawn of the 20th century of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and all of the elections associated with them. And all of those pieces kind of begin to really shift for the legislation that really comes into play in large part during the Wilson administration that are associated with the over-regulations of World War I. And with that, of course, emerges then in greater measure the woman's story. I value enormously the background of what women were doing. And what I know to be true, and this is so important to me, is that our students understand that during the course of the late 1800s, men had the political position, men had the wealth, men held the power. And what did women have? They find themselves in a true emergence post-Civil War, controlling their points of view, the rise of the middle-class women in urban areas and our own Southern women who were left home to Scarlett O'Hara-esque to manage the farms and plantations in the absence of their husbands. This emergence of the women from their domestic spheres in the mid-19th century into the public sphere at the beginning of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century as well. And seeing that transition take place through the desire for municipal housekeeping and doing good and finding problems that they could simply address and fix. And they did it through their church groups, they did it through clubs that they started forming, they did it through the newly emerging sororities that started happening in the latter part of the 1800s into the beginning of the 20th century. And all of these ways are pulling women outside of the home and putting them in the public sphere. And they get involved big time in temperance, in anti-alcohol, and social purity, and find their voices within that context, and then move on to use that voice that they have found and mastered in the push for suffrage. And in this first book on Tennessee women, just to be clear, Tennessee women were doing the same thing. And I think that's what our students need to know. And there are only two images here on the cover, but hopefully you can see what those are. Women in sport. We know the first women's sports teams start happening in the 1890s. And that represents the women playing basketball in Nashville. And all of those stories are in this book by wonderful scholars around the state who have done the research on this. In the upper image at the top, those ladies who look like nurses are actually members of women's tomato clubs. And it was viewed as still the economic destruction of the Civil War, post-Civil War era, where all of the South remained utterly destitute. There were missionary types who felt that trying to uplift our Tennessee rural women by giving them a means to can tomatoes and not only preserve those for their families, but also to sell them. And the canning that they did, intriguingly, was not the kind of canning I grew up with, which was the glass jar and the rubber ring, but they literally did cans, and they brought the technology around to be able to seal those in tin cans to communities. So Elizabeth Israels Perry herself is in this volume writing on a Gilded Age women and the role they played in Nashville and the centennial of Tennessee, and how women made themselves publicly visible through the women's pavilion at that Tennessee Centennial. Jan Leone used to be in the history department at this university, wrote about those powerful Methodist women and the work they did in settlement houses. We know that in northern cities in New York and Chicago, settlement was largely done in immigrant communities. Here in Tennessee, settlement work was done interracially. There was an enormous combination of African American Methodist women and white Methodist women who worked together to sort of work in what we would now refer to as inner city settings, but working together as women across racial lines to try to do socioeconomic and societal uplift. Professor Ham from Southwestern Virginia wrote on the role of Lutheran women's work in the rural schools in Appalachia. That was a really intriguing addition to me because honestly, being a Tennessean, I didn't know we had too much Lutheranism here, but apparently in the mountains of Tennessee we do. They had come down from Pennsylvania, again in sort of this post-Civil War academic outreach, and women were running schools for those poor mountain children the same way mountain schools were run all across our area. Paula Hinton from Tennessee Tech writes about the movements in Tennessee for anti-lynching. Obviously, the Southern Women's Anti-Lynching Society was very strong throughout the South, but Tennessee had chapters and activism in that regard, and some powerful roles of women who stood with guns at prison doors to prohibit mobs from entering county prisons to pull African Americans who were incarcerated out. Women and their daughters who withstood the pressure of the mob in order to do what was right. And Sonia Ramsey, who teaches in University of North Carolina, wrote on African American women teachers across Tennessee. So this is a wonderful understanding of the uplift that was going on through the teachers who had to really carry strong standards of uplift for folks within their own community, but also to counteract the negative imagery that was coming at them from white society. Mary Ellen Pethel, who teaches at Harpeth Hall in Nashville, actually is the one who wrote about women in sport. And of course, women in sport were precursors of the changes that took place in women's clothing at the beginning of the 20th century, just to be able to have the physical mobility. And they're wonderful photographs to look at what women were wearing to play games in the 1890s versus what they were wearing by the time of the 1920s. It is remarkable how women's clothing altered over the course of those 2.5 decades. And my own chapter in this book is about women's educational leaders. They were not allowed to lead. Education had become bifurcated at the beginning of the 20th century, and women were allowed to teach in the primary levels only, and men took the higher paid jobs in any of the leadership and principal positions. So any women who worked in leadership positions struggled to get there within academics and public education. But in this first volume, we really only scraped the surface, and I need you to know that we're working on this across the state now because we really need to include those other 90 counties. And we need your help in doing it, quite frankly. We need everybody's community help. I appreciate the communities that have stepped up to, either through Chick History or through some of the work we've done, or through teachers in their own classrooms to be digging around through their local papers or talking to their county historians or trying to draw attention to what went on in your county in this regard. We know that there were women's Christian temperance unions in over 70 communities across the state of Tennessee. We also know that there were about that many chapters of the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association across the state of Tennessee, but we don't know who was in them. We have lists of names, and they tended to be listed by their husbands' names, of course. Mrs. Joe Blow. And you're thinking, who is this person? And they don't say where it was from, other than the fact that the counties had them. So again, any way in which you can communicate that to us and me and to the Heritage Trail people, we want to know about that. Manoa Uffelman, who teaches at Austin P, is writing about the work of the Daughters of the Confederacy, who did a lot of monument raising, but they were also about education, and they were certainly about education of the lost cause. And many of those Daughters of the Confederacy, work that they did at about this time, they went both ways in terms of suffrage, just FYI. Josephine Pearson was actually funded in large part by a lot of the post-Civil War conservatism that wanted to hang on to the glorious cause idea and thinking, but there were others who were the Daughters of the Confederacy who were forward-thinking about the vote. Antoinette Van Zelm, who is here at the MTSU Center for Historic Preservation, conversely, is writing about women who were part of the there were wives and sisters and daughters of folks who had fought in the Federal Army and the Union Army, and were trying to articulate American ideals in a very hostile environment in the state of Tennessee during this time period, from the latter part of the 1800s into the beginning of the 20th century. Mary Ellen Pethel, again, who was in the first book, is going to be writing about women who worked to solve a lot of the issues in the inner city in terms of building homes for indigent women and trying to pull people out of poverty. The article that we've all been waiting for from Carol Busey, who teaches at Vol State, is going to be on the WCTU. And this is this pivotal, statewide, broad union and institution that was pervasive across our state. Really, every county almost supposedly had a chapter of it, but we know very little about it in its full scope, and she has been doing a lot of research in the WCTU archives to sort of excavate about the counties that were involved in these changes. And we know that Tennessee went dry in its desire to purify long before the 18th Amendment. Julia Smith Gibbons has ancestors from Pulaski area in Giles County, and she's writing on the farm women's groups, because women in the farm areas were not teachers, a lot of them not very educated, but they were, as with canning clubs, working on making money and trying to pull their families and communities out of poverty. Dr. Carol Van West, our Tennessee State historian, is writing on the women's civic leagues that produced, if you hadn't thought about it, restrooms at courthouses for ladies, but men who could come into town to vote could go take care of themselves in the woods, presumably, or on the periphery of town into some weed patch. But the ladies needed a place to hang out when they would come into town. And the notion that if women were going to vote, they had to be welcome in the public sphere in the courthouses is one that has physical architecture associated with it. And he has been documenting the emergence of restrooms at county seats at the beginning of the time of the vote for women. And Cindy Jones, who is a grad student finishing her PhD at the University of Alabama, is writing again on more African-American women who rose out of black college classrooms and were working proactively for race justice across the state of Tennessee. So those are some of the context pieces, so that everything is not just full-blown out of the head of Zeus, but is in fact very organic to the history and indigenous cultures within Tennessee as this progressive shift and change is taking place. But in the process of it, the vote comes with it. And here's where we're trying to expand that narrative of the perfect 36. Matthew Hibden, who did his graduate work here at MTSU, he's now with ODK, an honor society in southwestern Virginia, but he's writing on these women's colleges and seminaries and schools across Tennessee as the catalysts for the 19th century change. And so many women, a single graduate from here and a single graduate from there, went on across the state of Tennessee to do enormous things. Aaron Astor teaches at Maryville College in East Tennessee, and he's writing on the Ossley Circle, again, women's club work in East Tennessee that generated woman suffrage in their area. Don Entz, who's finishing his master's here at MTSU, is writing on many of the men whose votes and voices shifted in the state legislature, sort of to expand beyond Harry Byrne. Those things have been written individually, but he's trying to compile those. Melanie Schemberger from Murray State up in Kentucky is looking at hometown newspapers, and Miranda Fraley Rhodes at the Tennessee State Museum is using the voices of Tennessee women in their own diaries and in their own publications to really be able to shape the story coming from different quarters than we normally do. And I've already told you that I'm trying to dig and find the work of suffrage women in the Upper Cumberland, and it is really like looking for a needle in a haystack. So again, I'd be so pleased to have any thoughts or admonitions that you could share with me if you know of individuals, people, or even proper nouns that I can do when I'm going through microfilm search. So I leave you with, what can you do with your students in your communities? And I want it always to be the civic lesson. I believe we're in for the civic learning. I believe we're in to teach our students about their roles and their activism. I think the extent to which we make this personal, that's why it's so good to have the connections into the local communities, to have it not be textbook, to have it be actual young people, activists in areas that are near our very own who are seeking a greater voice and who are seeking greater democracy and equality and access. All of these were built, of course, on the post-Civil War amendments. Women found that they were kicked out of the 14th Amendment, and the activism kicked in big time nationally, and Tennessee was involved with all of that as well. So the civics lessons are built into the story. The story is bigger than the Perfect 36th. And getting our students in a position where they understand the role of the 15th Amendment, the role of the 19th Amendment, the role of the vote for 18-year-olds. This is so very, very important because the participation and actions of our young people are our future, and it's certainly what I care about. Oh, I know one thing I can tell you, and I didn't put this in my outline, but I'll just show it to you now. We're doing a lot at MTSU of reacting to the past. Are you all doing that in high school classes? Do you know about it? See, hands up if you've heard about it. It's role-playing games. We've been doing here, I think, for about 7 years now. And there is one really, well, there's several, but one really good one that I use on suffrage that's not Tennessee-based. It's called Greenwich Village 1913. And I take a number of weeks. I really just sort of pause everything it has a big documents collection in the back. And we do role play as if we were in a bohemian salon in New York City, on the Lower East Side, and we were debating issues of importance to thinkers in around 1913, and this is getting ready for the great parade march on Washington, D.C. And it's an artificial pitting in this game of two opposing forces against each other. The two opposing forces are the women who say we're going to move forward as a society if we take on the right to vote and we really make our voice visible and we get our political leaders to listen to us in 1913, versus labor unionists who say we're going to have a big pageant in Paterson, New Jersey, and we're going to articulate for greater increased unionization in the factories and higher wages. And so again, this is a pretty soft dichotomy of opposing forces, because where are you going to go with this? Increased wage labor for workers in factories or the vote for women? It's hard to know which one is going to be the most important. But in the process of reading the primary documents, our students get into understanding in a more meaningful way what the time period was all about. One of our own faculty members here at MTSU is actually writing one of these role-playing games on the perfect 36th. And I guess she's going, I haven't seen it, I haven't read it, I've heard her tell about it, but I'm presuming it's going to be the Tennessee suffragists versus the Tennessee antis. And we're anxiously awaiting its arrival, and maybe it will be something too when it comes out and gets published. Norton is, the W.W. Norton is usually the publisher that does these Reacting to the Past games. So I've done many of these on different subject matters, but this is really the really good one on suffrage that really draws attention to students. And they have, you can take a month to do it, and I know you all don't have a month, so that's not even doable. But there are micro games, and you can take any of these and do it in one day. And I do this quite often. I'll have roll sheets, and I'll have a gameplay already, and we will have already read the primary documents in advance, so they've got an idea, but I spring it on them. They walk in the classroom, I hand out rolls to them, I give them a name tag and tell them who they are, and they immediately jump into dialogue, and I step into the background and become invisible, which is wonderful because they really enjoy engaging in these arguments that they make, and some of the arguments are pretty outlandish and maybe uninformed, but in the process of doing them, they really personalize the discussion, and it's a wonderful way for direct civic engagement within the classroom, and a micro game, a one-day micro game, is exceedingly useful. Maybe one of these teaching with primary sources, workshop days, being able to do a micro game for one of the workshops would be very, very useful, because for those of us who are faculty, unless we've been to a workshop where we've done it, we don't really understand what that experience feels like. But ma'am, it slams you right into the middle of the time period pretty quickly, and it does for our students as well. I expect it could be very successful. So I thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to discuss anything else if you're interested in it, but otherwise you're out a little bit early.
Thank you.